My father wrote his memoir. He summarized my entire childhood in 2 paragraphs. He gave my brother 15 pages. Let me say that again, not because I think you misheard me, but because I need you to understand the full weight of what I just said. My father, a retired English professor, a man who spent 40 years teaching the importance of narrative, of voice, of making sure every story gets told with the fullness it deserves, sat down, wrote the story of his life, and decided that 15 years of my childhood amounted to 2 paragraphs. Not 2 chapters, not 2 sections, 2 paragraphs. I know the exact word count. I counted. 212 words. Like and subscribe the channel, and tell us comments from where you are watching this video. My brother Rohan got 15 pages. Detailed, loving, carefully crafted pages. Pages about his Little League games, his first science fair, the night he got into medical school, the way my father looked at him when he crossed that stage. Pages about what my father felt when Rohan was born. Pages about conversations they had over chai at the kitchen table. Pages about road trips. Pages about arguments and reconciliations. 15 pages. For me, there were 2 paragraphs. One of them was mostly about my mother. I want to tell you about the day I found out. I want to tell you about what happened in my body when I read those 2 paragraphs for the first time. I want to tell you about the phone calls I didn't make, the wine I drank alone on my porch in Austin at 9 in the morning, the way I sat with that little self-published book in my hands and couldn't decide whether to close it or throw it across the room. But first, I need you to understand who my father is, because this story doesn't make sense without that. Nothing about this makes sense without understanding Vikram Patel. My father was, by every external measure, a remarkable man. Vikram Patel came to the United States in 1979 from Ahmedabad, Gujarat, with $40, a scholarship to the University of Michigan, and a mind that I have never, not once in my 38 years on this earth, seen matched for sharpness. He was a literature professor. He taught Victorian novels, post-colonial theory, and a senior seminar called Narrative Identity, Who Gets to Tell the Story? Which, I would like to point out to the universe, is the kind of irony that deserves its own paragraph. He was the kind of professor students waited 2 semesters to get into. The kind who assigned 60 pages of reading and made every single one of those pages feel urgent, relevant, alive. He had a gift for making you feel like the text you were holding was written specifically for you, specifically for this moment in your life. He was beloved, faculty awards, student tributes, a retirement party last spring that had people flying in from 3 different states. He was also, in the specific and private theater of our household, a man of deep and uncomplicated preferences. He preferred my brother. I want to be careful here because I know how that sentence sounds. It sounds like the complaint of a wounded child who couldn't measure up. It sounds like bitterness. It sounds like the kind of thing a therapist hears and files under perception, not reality. But I need you to stay with me because what I'm describing is not a perception. It is a documented, published, bound, and distributed fact. It is in the memoir. My father preferred Rohan. He preferred Rohan from the beginning, with the kind of straightforward, unself-conscious preference that people of a certain generation didn't bother to hide because they didn't think it needed hiding. Rohan was the son. In the architecture of what my father understood a family to be, built from the scaffolding of his own upbringing in Ahmedabad in the 1960s, the son was the primary story. The son was the continuation. The son was the legacy. I was the daughter, I was a paragraph, evidently. But here is what made it complicated. Here is what made it something other than a simple story of a man who loved one child more than another. My father also loved books, and my father also loved me. Those 2 things were true simultaneously, and they existed in genuine tension with each other for the entirety of my childhood. He is the reason I became an English professor. He read to me every night until I was 9 years old, not picture books, novels, chapters from novels. Adapted sometimes, paused for explanation, but real novels. A Little Princess, The Secret Garden, Great Expectations, Jane Eyre. I fell asleep to the sound of his voice reading Dickens, and I have never told anyone how much I loved those nights. I have never told anyone because those nights existed in such violent contrast to everything else. The invisibility, the overlooking, the way he would turn to Rohan at dinner to ask what he thought about something and forget, mid-sentence, that I had also had a thought. He gave me language. He gave me the tools I would later use to understand and articulate and survive the exact wound he was inflicting. There's something almost literary in that. He would probably appreciate it if I pointed it out. I haven't. The memoir was called A Life in Letters, Reflections of an Immigrant Scholar. He spent 4 years writing it. I knew he was working on it. He mentioned it occasionally. I'm working on something, nothing major, with the practiced modesty of a man who absolutely believed it was major. My mother knew. Rohan knew. I knew in the abstract way you know about things that don't include you. He self-published it through a service that printed hardcover copies. He ordered 50 of them. He sent them to extended family in India, aunts, uncles, cousins I'd seen twice in my life. He gave copies to his former colleagues. He gave copies to his neighbors. He mailed mine to me in Austin with a handwritten note. The note said, "Asha, I hope you find something of value in these pages. With love, Papa." I remember sitting at my kitchen table with the package in front of me. I teach literature for a living. I assign memoirs to my students. I talk about memoir as a form of self-construction, the way every memoirist selects, arranges, and illuminates certain truths while leaving others in shadow. I have given entire lectures on the ethics of memoir, on who gets silenced by another person's telling. I sat there thinking, this is my father's story. He deserves to tell it the way he needs to tell it. I opened the book. I started reading. The first 100 pages were his childhood in India, vivid, beautifully written, specific in the way that only genuine memory can be specific. The smell of his mother's kitchen, the particular weight of monsoon air. His father, whom I never met, rendered in careful detail. The set of his jaw, the way he worked, the things he said when he was proud and when he was not. It was genuinely good writing. My father was a skilled writer. I want to say that clearly. I don't want this story to be about a man who wrote a bad book. This was a good book, which made what came next hurt more, not less. I read about his arrival in America, his scholarship, his early years at Michigan, the students who challenged him, the colleagues who welcomed him, the ones who didn't. His marriage to my mother, tender, observed, full of the small graces of their early years together. And then Rohan. Rohan's birth takes up 6 pages by itself. The drive to the hospital, the waiting room where my father paced and prayed, the moment he held his son for the first time, the feeling, he wrote, of understanding for the first time why a man would want to live forever, so he could watch this boy become everything. So he could watch this boy. I found my name on page 147. I had been reading for 2 hours. I was so deep in the book that I had almost forgotten to be anxious about it. And then there was my name. I read the 2 paragraphs slowly, and then I read them again. And then I sat very still for a long time. The first paragraph introduced me. Asha was born in 1987, completing our family. She was a bright and curious child, interested from an early age in books and stories, a quality we shared. She grew into a thoughtful young woman who pursued academics with dedication. The second paragraph was about my mother's experience of having a second child, my mother's exhaustion, my mother's adjustment to 2 children, my mother's grace. I was summarized in 59 words. My mother's experience of me took up the remaining 153. I was 37 years old when I read those paragraphs. I have a doctorate. I have published 2 books of literary criticism. I have tenure. I have an ex-husband and an apartment full of plants and a cat named Wolf, as in Virginia. I have been teaching other people's children how to find themselves inside stories for over a decade. And reading those two paragraphs, I was 7 years old again. I was 7 years old and I had just come home with a perfect score on a math test, and my father had glanced at it and said, "Good, good," and then called Rohan in from the other room to show him something on the television. I was 7 years old, and it was the first time I understood that good, good was not the same as being seen. I didn't call my father. This is notable because I call my father every Sunday. I have called my father every Sunday for 15 years. It started when I moved to Austin for my job and my mother said, "Call your father," with the implication, as she always had, that he needed a little management, a little prompting to perform the rituals of connection. I have been managing my father's connection to me my entire adult life. I didn't call that Sunday. I sent a text that said busy with grading, will call soon, and then I sat on my porch with a glass of wine and watched a squirrel do something inexplicable in my neighbor's oak tree. I told my best friend Priya. Priya has known me since grad school. She is a molecular biologist with the emotional intelligence of a novelist and the directness of someone who has spent 20 years correcting student lab reports. She said, "That's not okay, Asha." "I know," I said. "He has to know that's not okay." "Does he?" I said. "I genuinely don't know if he knows." This is the question that tortured me in those early days. Because there are two possible explanations for my father's memoir, and they are both devastating, but they are devastating in entirely different ways. The first explanation, he knew. He made a conscious choice to give Rohan 15 pages and give me 2 paragraphs because, in his heart, in the deep, unchallenged architecture of his values, Rohan's story was the one worth telling. This would mean my father looked at his life and decided, deliberately, that I was a footnote. The second explanation, he didn't know. He wrote from instinct, from what felt natural, from the grooves worn deep in him by 68 years of living in a world that told him sons were primary. He didn't count the pages. He didn't compare. He didn't notice. This would mean my father erased me without even realizing I was there to erase. I went back and forth between these two for weeks. I'd be in the middle of class, I was teaching a unit on memoir, because of course I was, and I'd stop mid-sentence and think, does he know? And I'd look at my students, most of them 20 years old, all of them waiting to be seen, and I'd think about what I'd say to them if their father had done this. I'd think about what I'd assign them to read. I'd think about the essays I'd have them write. I couldn't sleep well. I'd wake at 3 in the morning and lie there running through the specific memories my father had chosen not to include. That's the other thing about those 2 paragraphs. They weren't just an absence. They were a deletion, because I know my father remembers more than 2 paragraphs worth. I know he remembers the night I won the district spelling bee in 4th grade. I know because he was there. He drove me. He sat in the 3rd row and I could see his face from the stage, careful, composed, the face he wore when he was hoping for something. I won, I spelled conscientious. I remember the exact moment, conscientious, and I looked out at the audience and found his face and he was proud, genuinely proud. He clapped. He stood up actually, which was more than he usually allowed himself. He did not include this. I know he remembers driving me to the hospital when I was 14, and I'd broken my arm falling off a bike. I remember lying in the back seat trying not to cry because I knew crying made him uncomfortable, and he kept saying, "It's okay, Asha, it's okay, we're almost there." And he said it in Gujarati, which he almost never did in those years, which meant he was scared. He held my hand in the waiting room. He read to me from a magazine, doing different voices, trying to make me laugh, succeeding. He did not include this. I know he remembers my college graduation. I was first in my class. I gave the student address. I can look back on that speech now with the critical eye of someone who teaches writing and see that it was technically competent and emotionally safe. I was 22 and had not yet learned how to put anything real on a page. But it was a graduation speech, and I gave it, and my father was in the audience. He did not include this. He included Rohan's Little League. He included Rohan's science fair. He included Rohan's graduation, 3 pages, with specific quotes from the speech Rohan gave, and a description of the way my mother cried, and the dinner they had afterward, and the wine Vikram drank to celebrate his son becoming a man. I don't hate my brother, I want to be absolutely clear about this. Rohan and I have talked about the memoir exactly once, and he was horrified. Not performed horror, genuine horror. He called me and said, Asha, I didn't know, and I believe him, because Rohan is one of the decent ones. He doesn't know what to do with what our father gave him at my expense, and neither do I, and that's a conversation we're going to have eventually, but we haven't yet because it's very hard. I love my brother. The disparity is not Rohan's fault. The disparity is the fault of a man who should have known better because he spent his entire professional life arguing that it mattered. About 6 weeks after the book arrived, I went to a conference in Chicago. A gathering of literature scholars, the kind where you drink bad hotel coffee and argue about things that matter intensely to a very small number of people. I was on a panel about life writing and ethics. Memoir, autobiography, the question of whose truth gets told when you write about shared experience. I should not have been on this panel. I should have recused myself. But I hadn't told anyone outside of Priya about the memoir, so no one knew I was sitting on a stage talking about the ethics of narrative exclusion while personally experiencing the ethics of narrative exclusion at the hands of my own father. After the panel, a woman came up to me. She introduced herself as Margaret Cole. She was an editor at a mid-sized literary press in New York, not one of the giants, but respected, serious. She was in her mid-50s, silver-haired, with the particular energy of someone who has read more books than she will ever be able to talk about, and is always slightly impatient to talk about more of them. She said, "Your comments about silencing within family memoir were the most interesting thing I've heard at this conference in 3 years. They sounded personal." I laughed. "I'm a literature professor," I said. "Everything sounds personal." She looked at me for a moment. "Are you working on something?" she asked. "I'm always working on something," I said. "No," she said. "I mean, are you working on something that you're not ready to say you're working on?" There was a long pause. I have been trained by years of academic conference culture to be strategic about what I admit to working on. You don't say something is in progress until it is far enough along to defend. You don't let the idea out of the bag before you have enough words on the page to prove it's real. I looked at Margaret Cole. "My father wrote a memoir," I said. "He summarized my childhood in 2 paragraphs. He gave my brother 15 pages. The silence between us lasted exactly long enough. Then she said, "Write the response." The response. Write the account he didn't write. Your childhood, your voice, your specific memories. Write it as an essay, not for publication, not for a journal, not for me. Write it for him. And when you're done, give it to him to read." I stared at her. "He's a literature professor," she said. "He taught narrative. Make him sit inside the narrative he chose not to tell." I went back to my hotel room, and I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. I opened my laptop. I started to write. Here is what no one tells you about writing toward a wound. It doesn't hurt less as you go. You expect it to. You've heard about catharsis, about the healing power of putting things into words, and maybe for some people and some wounds that is exactly what happens. For me, it got harder. Every memory I pulled up was a reminder of what hadn't been included. Every specific detail, the spelling bee, the broken arm, the graduation, was both an act of recovery and an act of grief. I was writing things that should have already been written. I was filling in an absence. There's something indescribably strange about writing your own childhood as though it needs to be proven. But I kept going. I wrote at night, after my students went home, after I'd finished grading and emailing, and doing the thousand small tasks that make up a professorial life. I wrote on weekends. I wrote in the margins of other people's stories for 2 months. I wrote about being born. My father's book covered his emotional experience of Rohan's birth in 6 pages. I knew my mother's version of my own birth from the stories she told her stories, not his. The things she remembered, which were different from the things he might have remembered. But I wrote his version as I could best reconstruct it. The second child arriving, the family now complete, what that completion might have felt like if you were a man who had always intended to prioritize differently, who had never quite examined that intention. I didn't write to be cruel, I wrote to be honest. I wrote about growing up in the house on Westhaven Drive. The specific geography of our home, where things were, how things smelled, what you could hear from which room. I wrote about the kitchen table where my father graded papers, and where I used to sit doing homework, and where we existed in the same space without quite making contact. I wrote about Sunday mornings when he would make chai and read the newspaper, and sometimes, if I was very quiet, he would read aloud from something interesting, an article, a review, and those moments felt like being let in, briefly, to a room where he lived. I wrote about the spelling bee. I wrote about this in 4 pages. I wrote about the drive to the auditorium, the way he gripped the steering wheel, the rules he went over with me again even though I knew them. I wrote about sitting backstage with the other contestants and feeling, for the first time in my life, like I was good at something that was entirely mine, not school, which belonged partly to his expectations, not reading, which was his gift to me and therefore also his, but this. Competition. Under pressure. Alone on a stage. I wrote about the moment I looked out and found his face. I wrote he was sitting in the 3rd row, wearing the gray sweater my mother had given him for his birthday, and when I found his eyes he did not smile. My father was not a man who performed emotion publicly, but he nodded. One single, clean nod. And I thought, he sees me. He is here and he sees me. And I spelled the word correctly. I wrote about being 14 and breaking my arm. I wrote about that drive to the hospital in the specific way you can only write about something that you have turned over in your memory for decades, looking at it from every angle until you know every surface. The back seat. The streetlights going past. His voice saying okay, okay, almost there. The Gujarati, the held hand. I wrote about the hospital waiting room, the plastic chairs, the fluorescent light, the magazine he found, the way he attempted different voices even though he was tired and scared and his daughter was in pain. I wrote, he read to me. He had always read to me, and even then, even at 42 with a frightened child in a hospital waiting room, he read to me. It is one of the truest things I know about him. He is not always present, but when he reads, he is entirely present. When there is a story between us, he is there. I wrote about being in high school and discovering that I could write, not just read, not just absorb, but create. The first essay that made my English teacher stop me after class. The first paper that came back with comments that were not corrections but conversations. The first time I understood that what my father did for a living was something I wanted to do. I wrote about not telling him this. About keeping it private, protective, the way you keep something safe from a weather system you can't predict. I wrote about watching him with Rohan, taking Rohan to campus, introducing him to colleagues, letting him audit a class once, and choosing not to ask for the same thing because I already knew the architecture of the answer. I wrote, I did not want to be a responsibility he discharged. I wanted to be chosen. There is a difference, and I had learned it early, and so I protected myself by asking for nothing. A child who asks for nothing will not be refused. I learned this economy of want at 7 years old, and I have been practicing it ever since. I wrote about college, about the strange freedom of being somewhere he was not, where I was not anyone's daughter, where my name had no context attached to it. I wrote about discovering that I was good, genuinely, measurably good, at the things he had spent his life doing. The first undergraduate conference where I presented a paper. The professor who pulled me aside and said you should go to graduate school. the first acceptance to a doctoral program. I wrote about calling home to tell them, about my mother's joy, which was immediate and total and unqualified, about my father's response. Well, that's good, that's the right choice. That's the right choice. 4 words. I have been parsing those 4 words for 15 years. Was it pride, contained as he always contained it? Was it approval, which from him was never warm but was always real? Or was it simply the acknowledgement that the choice made sense, was logical, was appropriate? The same response he might have given to a student who'd made a sensible academic decision. I don't know, I have never known. And I wrote about not knowing, which is different from writing about being unloved. I was not unloved. I want to be very clear about this. I was not unloved. I was unseen. And those are different, and the difference matters, and it has taken me 38 years to find the precise language for it. I wrote about my wedding. I was married for 6 years to a man named David, who was kind and smart and fundamentally misaligned with everything I needed, and we parted without drama or destruction, which is more than most people manage. But the wedding I wrote about was not the marriage. I wrote about my father walking me down the aisle. He cried. This surprised me. My father, who I had never seen cry, not at his own parents' funerals, not at films, not at any of the moments that tend to unlock men who have kept themselves locked, cried at my wedding. Silent tears, quickly wiped, the face composed immediately after. But real, unmistakable. I didn't know what to do with that then. I still don't, entirely. I wrote about standing at the top of the aisle and looking at him, and seeing something that I couldn't name but that felt like what I had always been looking for. And then I wrote about walking forward, and about the ceremony, and about the reception dinner where he gave a toast that was gracious and appropriate, and said almost nothing specifically about me. I wrote, he cried when I left him at the altar to join my husband, and then he gave a toast that could have been about any daughter. I think both things are true about him. I think he felt it and could not say it, and for a long time I made excuses for the gap between what he felt and what he said, and I am done making those excuses now. Not out of anger. Out of grief. The grief of someone who finally understood that the person you love most having feelings for you is not enough. Feelings, unspoken, unlanguaged, untold, might as well not exist. My father taught me this in his classroom about literature. He forgot to apply it to his own family. When I finished the draft, I sent it to Priya. She read it in 2 days and called me from her car in a parking lot somewhere in Boston. She was crying. Priya does not cry easily. Priya once watched a film that made our entire book club weep openly and said, afterward, that she found it effectively manipulative, which is the molecular biologist equivalent of saying you felt something but weren't about to admit it. She was crying in a parking lot. She said, Asha, this is extraordinary. It's too long, I said. It's exactly as long as it needs to be. He's not going to like it. He's not supposed to like it. He's supposed to read it. I went back and revised for another 3 weeks. I cut things that were there for my own relief rather than for truth. I added things I'd left out because they were too raw, too specific, too much, and then I put them back in, because too raw and too specific and too much was exactly the point. The final essay was 46 pages long. 46 pages, to his 2 paragraphs. I printed it at the University Press Center, used their good paper. I put it in a plain folder, not a binder, not a bound book. A folder, because it was not trying to compete with his book. It was just trying to exist. I flew home to Phoenix for Thanksgiving. My mother knew I was bringing something. I had told her vaguely that I was bringing something for my father, something I'd written, and she had looked at me over the phone. I could feel the look through the receiver and said, "Is this about the book?" "Yes," I said. A pause. "Be kind," she said. "I am being kind," I said. "This is the kindest version." She didn't push further. My mother is a woman of enormous intelligence and carefully calibrated restraint. She has spent 40 years inside this family and has made her own peace with its architecture in ways I both respect and will never fully understand. She is not my ally in the way that Priya is my ally, but she is my mother, and she loves me without the complicated apparatus of conditions. Thanksgiving dinner was the dinner before. My father was in good spirits. He has been, since his retirement, the kind of content that looks like happiness, purposeful, occupied, without the institutional anxieties of academic life. He cooked some things, and my mother cooked others, and Rohan came with his wife Kavita and their 2 kids, and the house was full of the particular noise of a family that loves each other and has never quite figured out how. My father told a story about a former student who had emailed him about the memoir. He said it was moving, my father said. He remembered the unit on Hardy I described. The memoir has been very well received, my mother said, in the tone of a woman who has practiced this sentence. I said nothing. After dinner, when the kids were asleep in the guest room and Rohan and Kavita were watching something in the living room, I sat with my father in the kitchen. He was doing the crossword. He does the crossword every night, old-fashioned, in ink, the way people of his generation do crosswords. A form of discipline he has maintained since graduate school. I put the folder on the table. Papa, I said, I need you to read something. He looked at the folder, he looked at me. What is this? It's something I wrote, about our family. Something shifted in his face, not defensiveness, not yet, but a kind of careful attention, the attention of a man who has read enough literature to know that what comes next matters. Now, he said. Tomorrow, I said, I want to be there when you read it. I want to sit with you while you read. He didn't ask why, which surprised me. I had prepared for questions. Instead, he said, all right. And we went back to the crossword. The next morning, after breakfast, after my mother had taken Kavita and the kids to the mall and Rohan had gone to meet a friend, I sat down with my father in the living room. He was in his chair, the wingback near the window, dark blue, the chair he has sat in for 20 years, that has the exact impression of him in its cushions. I sat across from him on the couch. I put the folder on the coffee table between us. You want to sit here while I read, he said. Yes. He considered this. That's unusual. I know. Why? I had rehearsed this. I had rehearsed it for 6 weeks. Because, I said, I wrote it for you to read, not to put on a shelf, and because I need to see your face. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he picked up the folder and opened it. I had written a brief preface, a single paragraph at the front. Papa, this is the account of the 15 years you did not include. I am not giving this to you as an attack. I am giving it to you as a correction. You have always told your students that every story deserves to be told in full. I am asking you to extend that standard to me. Asha. I watched him read the preface. I watched his face do something careful and closed. Then he turned the page and started reading. I don't know if you've ever sat across from someone you love and watched them read something that was true about them and about you and about the space between you. It is one of the most particular experiences I have ever had. It is nothing like any other kind of watching. You are watching someone be confronted with a mirror, and you cannot look away, and you cannot help them, and you cannot know what they are seeing until they decide to tell you. He read slowly. My father reads everything slowly. He was a literature professor. He marks pages mentally even when he isn't holding a pen. I could see him doing it, the slight pause, the subtle movement of his lips sometimes, the settling back into the chair when something landed. He reached the spelling bee. I watched his face change. It was not a dramatic change. My father does not do drama, but something shifted, something opened, briefly, in the careful architecture of his expression. He kept reading. He reached the broken arm. I watched him put the folder down on his knee for a moment and look out the window. He looked out the window for perhaps 30 seconds. Then he picked the folder back up. He read for an hour and 40 minutes. I sat across from him for an hour and 40 minutes without speaking, without looking at my phone, without leaving the room. I had brought my own book, a reflex. I always bring a book, and I set it next to me and didn't open it. The room was very quiet. The house was making its ordinary sounds. Outside, the neighborhood was doing whatever it does on the Friday after Thanksgiving. When he finished, he closed the folder. He held it in his lap for a moment. Then he said, "You gave me 46 pages." "Yes," I said. Another pause. "I gave you 2 paragraphs." "Yes." He looked at the folder, he looked at his hands, he looked at the window. "The spelling bee," he said. "Yes." "I remembered that," he said. "I remember driving there. I remember watching you from the 3rd row." "I know," I said. "You were wearing your gray sweater." He looked at me. "You noted the sweater," he said. "I noted everything," I said. "That's what daughters do. That's what people do when they're trying to be seen. They notice everything because they're always looking for evidence." The silence between us was different from the silences before. It was full instead of empty. Full of the 46 pages, full of the 2 paragraphs, full of the spelling bee and the hospital and the chai in the mornings and the wedding, and all the space between what he felt and what he said. "I don't have an explanation that will be adequate," he said finally. "I'm not asking for an explanation," I said. "I'm asking for acknowledgement. Love. That it happened. That I existed fully in those 15 years, and that when you told the story of your family, you told it as though I didn't." He was quiet. "Not deliberately," he said, and his voice had something in it I had not heard before, not exactly pain, but its first cousin. "I know it wasn't deliberate," I said. "That's almost worse. That means it was automatic. That means you didn't have to try to erase me. It just happened. I fell out of the story naturally because you never quite put me there." He flinched, my father who does not flinch. "I made assumptions," he said after a long moment, "that I did not examine." "Yes." "I assumed," he stopped. "You assumed that Rohan's story was the story," I said. "That your relationship with your son was the heart of the narrative. That I was part of the background." Lisha. "I'm not angry, Papa." And this was true. I had been angry for weeks, but sitting across from him in that room, I was not angry. I was something that took me a moment to identify, and when I identified it, it surprised me. I was sad. Simply, cleanly sad. Sad for the girl who had not made it into the book. Sad for the father who had not known she was missing. Sad for the years of this. The patient, exhausting, invisible work of being a daughter in a family where the son was the story. "I cried at your wedding," he said suddenly. "I know," I said. "I wrote about it." "Did you know why?" I looked at him. No. He looked at the folder again. "Because I could see that you were fine without me," he said. "That you had built something, a life, a self that didn't need my permission. That you had done it in spite of," he stopped again. "In spite of the 2 paragraphs," I said. He made a sound, not a laugh, not quite, something between. "Yes," he said, "in spite of what I failed to give you." He looked at me then directly for a long moment. "Your writing," he said, "has always been better than mine." It was such an unexpected sentence that I had no prepared response for it. "It's precise," he said. "It's honest in a way that," he stopped, started again. "I was not honest in my memoir. I told myself I was being selective. Memoirists are selective. But there's a difference between selection and omission, and his voice did something. I omitted you, and you were the most interesting person in the family." I sat very still. "I was afraid of you," he said. Since you were small, you saw things too clearly. You would look at me sometimes across the dinner table and I knew you saw the gaps in me, the places where I was smaller than I wanted to be. Rohan never looked at me that way. Rohan accepted me as I was. He paused. You always seem to be measuring. I was hoping, I said. There's a difference. I wasn't measuring you against a standard. I was hoping you'd surprise me. He looked at the window again. I didn't, he said. No, I said, but you can now. The quiet came back, but it was different again. It had shifted, the way weather shifts. What do you want from me? He said. I want you to add pages, I said. Not to the memoir, I don't care about the memoir. I want you to add pages to the time we have left. I want you to know that I was there. That I am here. That the story of your life includes me, fully, specifically, with the gray sweater and the hospital waiting room and the spelling bee and the crossword puzzles and the chai and the reading, all of it. I want to be in the version you carry in your head, even if it's too late for the version you bound and gave to Aunt Priyanka in Ahmedabad. Something moved across his face. Your Aunt Priyanka, he said, did not need to read about the spelling bee. No, I said, but I needed you to remember it. He looked at me. I remember it, he said. I know, I said. Write it down, for you, not for the book, just for you, because things we don't write down we lose, you taught me that. He looked at the folder in his lap. He looked at me. You are better at this than I am, he said again. Yes, I said, because you taught me. That was 8 months ago. I want to tell you that everything changed. I want to give you the clean version, the one where my father immediately revised his internal memoir, and we spent Thanksgiving in a new kind of wholeness, and all the gaps were filled, and all the years of quiet accumulation were addressed and resolved. That didn't happen. What happened was, we sat in that living room for another 2 hours after the reading. We talked, really talked, the way we almost never had, about the things underneath the surface things. He told me about his own father, the silences he had grown up inside, the unexamined template he had carried forward. He said unexamined himself, that specific word. It struck me as the most honest thing he'd said in 40 years. He asked me questions, real questions, the kind that require an answer longer than good. He asked about my work, not in the polite academic way he usually asked, but with genuine curiosity about what I was thinking, what I was arguing, what I was finding in the texts I taught. We talked about a novel I'm working on which he didn't know about because I had never told him, because I had been protecting it. I told him about it. He leaned forward in his chair. I flew back to Austin 2 days later. He called me on Sunday. Like I call him, now he calls me. It's not repaired. I want to be honest about that. The 2 paragraphs are still in the book, and 50 copies of the book are still distributed to relatives who now believe that my childhood is summarized, complete and total, in 212 words. But here is what I know, 8 months later. He is reading me differently. The way you read a text, you've been given new context for the same words but different meaning. He mentions things when we talk, small things, memories, the kind of specific detail that means someone has been thinking about the past. He mentioned the spelling bee, 3 months after Thanksgiving, completely without prompting. He said, I've been thinking about the night you won. You were so composed. I didn't tell you then, but I was astonished. I held my phone very still. I was hoping, I said. I know, he said. I know that now. It is not everything, it is something. I saw Margaret Cole again this spring, another conference, this one in Portland. I found her in the coffee line and told her what had happened. She listened to the whole thing, the essay, the Thanksgiving, the living room, the 2 hours. When I finished, she said, Are you going to publish it? No, I said. I told him it wasn't for publication. I know, but things change. Would you consider? No, I said again. It was for him, it did what it was supposed to do, that's enough. She nodded, she looked at her coffee. The thing about memoir, she said, is that people write them because they want to be the author of their own story. But no one is the author of their own story. We're all characters in other people's stories simultaneously. The danger is when you forget that. He forgot, I said. He remembered, she said. Eventually. Because I made him. Yes, and that, she said, is its own kind of power. She was right. I have thought about that a lot in the months since. There is power in the refusal to let your story go untold. There is power in sitting across from someone and saying, I was here. I was here the whole time. You may not have written me down, but I was here, and I remember, and I have the words to prove it. I was an English professor's daughter. He gave me language. I used it. I want to say one thing before we finish. To anyone listening who has been summarized. Anyone who has been the footnote in someone else's story. Anyone who has watched another person receive the detail, the pages, the recognition, while you received the paragraph, the glance, the good, and the turn back. You are not the 2 paragraphs. You are the 46 pages. You are every specific thing that happened to you. Every spelling bee and broken arm and hospital waiting room and graduation and wedding, and Sunday morning, and cup of chai and book read aloud, and voice going quiet in Gujarati when someone was scared and proud and unable to say it. You are not the summary, you are the story. Write it down. Not necessarily for them, not necessarily for anyone. Write it because the things we don't write, we lose. Because the stories that go untold don't stay silent, they become absence, and absence accumulates, and one day you wake up and the absence has taken up more space than everything else. Write it. Be in your own story. Take the 46 pages. You were here.